Out the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. Finding a chief of staff for every executive, empowering chief of staff through community. One of her advocacy, no other than Miss Clara Ma.
Hi, everyone. Excited to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Daniel. I'm so excited to chat with you, talk about books that I've read and I've loved, and excited for this conversation.
Welcome to Book 101, Miss Clara. And can you please introduce more about yourself?
Absolutely. My name is Clara, and I'm the founder and CEO of Ask a Chief of Staff. As you probably heard Daniel introduce at the beginning of this show, work with chiefs of staff in two main ways. One is through our community platform, where we empower chiefs of staff through workshops, mentorship, and coaching and education. And the other half of our business is executive recruitment and placement. We find executives their perfect strategic right hand and place chiefs of staff with their next opportunities alongside CEOs and other high powered executives.
Miss Clara, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. And today, let's talk about behind the scenes with the chief of staff, the secret weapon of every founder's needs. Miss Clara, can you describe what a chief of staff does in a typical day and how the role adapt to a founder's needs?
Absolutely. So, with anything chief of staff related, the short answer is always going to be it depends. It really depends on the day, the time of year, the executive that they work on and work with. But the acronym that I like to give everyone when I get asked a question, what does a chief of staff do, is a very simple three-letter acronym, COS. And that stands for culture, operations, and strategy. And all of that encompasses what a chief of staff is going to work on and what their mandate is when it comes to supporting their executive. When it comes to chief of staff, the executive that they're supporting, we call that person the principal. Sometimes it's a CEO, usually it is the CEO of the company, but it can also be other executives within the company as well. It could be a COO. I've seen chiefs of staff to the CTO. At larger organizations, maybe they are VP or director. And so the main thing to keep in mind here is that the relationship between principal and chief of staff is the most important one in this role. What you are doing is that you are trying to free up your executive's time so that your executive can work in their zone of genius. What are the things that only the executive can do? Why were they the person to found this company and run this business? And everything else that needs to be done at an executive level, but doesn't necessarily need to be done by that executive, gets delegated over to the chief of staff. So on a day to day, that might look like something like preparing a board deck or investor communications. It could be working on the strategic planning for the company, OKRs, tracking KPIs. It could sometimes be something like looking at office leasing. When I was a chief of staff, I happened to start my role in February of 2020. And so we were doing the opposite of office leases. We were trying to figure out how do we get out of our lease since the pandemic was upon us and we didn't need office space anymore. So it's really about being this power player to your executive, filling in the gaps where needed, and doing whatever it takes to help move the business forward.
Very well said, Miss Clara. Very well said. How did you first become interested in or transition into the chief of staff role?
Yeah, so to tell you a little bit more about my career journey, I started off actually in recruiting. I started recruiting for other early stage companies as a third party recruiter. And from there, I really realized that instead of working with startups, I would love to work in a startup. And so I transitioned my career from functional recruiting into working at startups. And at startups, you wear a lot of different hats. The smallest startup I ever worked at was four people. So that we didn't have a marketing team, a sales team, a product team. I played a lot of those different roles in my day to day. And I really got to see how business was being built from the ground up. As I continued on in my career, I really focused in on operations. But as you probably know, operations can mean a lot of things at startups. It's still wearing a lot of hats, filling a lot of gaps. And so at one of the startups that I worked at, I was trying to figure out how I could step more into an executive or leadership role so that I could see how decisions were made, really see how the business is run from a top down perspective. But I wanted to continue to have a wide breadth of the things that I was going to work on. And that's how I came across the chief of staff role. I saw that the chief of staff role was something that could continue to utilize my very wide skill set but take it up to the next level so that I can sit in the decision making room with other executives. And that's how I decided to take the next step into my career and apply for chief of staff roles and eventually landed at a Series AI startup where that really kicked off my chief of staff journey.
Miss Clara, how do you prioritize tasks when managing competing demands from a founder and their team?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I know that that's something that a lot of chiefs of staff deal with. It seems like there are a million different things that are a priority and everything needs to be handled all at once. But one common refrain that you'll hear with a lot of chiefs of staff is that if everything is a priority, then nothing is a priority. And so it's really important that you are helping manage upwards. You are talking to your executive to really hone in on the top three most important things that are going to move the needle forward. If you have 10 competing priorities, you're not going to do any of them well. At most, you could maybe juggle three or four at any given time. And so it's really important to keep a pulse on your executive to make sure that you're continuously checking in with them to understand what it is that is top priority and making sure that if there's another priority that comes into the picture, then something else has to go off the list. And that way you can really make sure that the things that are most important are always kept top of mind.
What makes the chief of staff position a secret weapon for founders in your experience?
Yeah, the thing that I would say what makes a chief of staff a secret weapon is that it gives back the CEO time. It gives back the executive that you're working with time to focus on their zone of genius. Again, zone of genius being the thing that only that executive can do, right? Whether they're the chief technology officer or the chief strategy officer, they are best equipped to spend their time on the highest leverage things for the company. A chief of staff is going to be able to take a lot of things off of their plate that, again, need to be done at a high level, but don't necessarily need to be done by the executive. And what a chief of staff can do is brief them on the things that they need decisions on. They could brief them on the updates of the company, and it helps executives work on the business versus in the business.
Interesting indeed, Miss Clara. Beautifully articulated. What skills or qualities do you think are essential for an effective chief of staff?
For chiefs of staff, I always recommend a couple of key skill sets. One is an extremely high EQ. This is a people role at the end of the day. You are working very closely with an executive. And so, understanding people and understanding others within the organization is going to be such a key skill set for you to build. If you don't have an understanding of how to read the room, how to read between the lines, and how to understand people at their core level, you're going to have a really hard time understanding what are the things that are most important to help move the company forward. Then the other skill set that I always recommend is being highly organized. You are going to be juggling a lot of different projects and you need to keep tabs on everything and know what the latest status updates are and also what the next steps are moving forward. So if you're not a highly organized person, you're most likely not going to thrive in this role. You're going to have to really figure out what are the mental capabilities that you can build in order to be very on top of the ball and understand, you know, all the details of everything that is going on. Then the
Can
last, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, the last skill set that I was going to mention here is that we are definitely in an AI world. Usually I don't recommend that you have to go and learn any skill sets in particular, and you're going to learn a lot of them on the job, but with AI changing the way that it is, I think it's important for chiefs of staff to have an opinion about AI and potentially be using it to make themselves more efficient in any given setting.
Can you describe a situation where you acted as a bridge between a founder and their team?
Yeah, I would definitely say that when I was a chief of staff, I often played the bridge between our CEO, and then the rest of the team. Most of our team was engineers and scientists, and what we wanted to do was, share the accomplishments and the things that they were working with a wider audience. And our CEO, for example, wanted to create a newsletter that would go out to a larger audience, not always technical, but some technical, some non-technical. And so what I had to do in that situation was to gather a lot of the information from our engineering team, from our scientists, translate it into a more kind of readable or a more audience appealing type of writing, and then funnel that up to my CEO to have that sent out. So, I think it's important to kind of speak different languages, or even if you are not an engineer yourself, but you're working with a lot of engineers, to understand on their level what's the vocabulary that they're using, what are the things that they find are most important, and be able to level with them and get on their bandwidth or their wavelength and really kind of understand what it is that they are trying to convey and be able to translate that upward and outward.
Miss Clara, how do you help a founder stay focused on a long-term goals amidst daily chaos?
Yeah. Think it's important to know what your North Star is and what the ultimate mission of the company is, right? If you are able to always kind of point them back in that direction, then you're able to help them prioritize and also ruthlessly prioritize and strike out the things that are not important. So, sometimes founders can read an article, or maybe there's something happening in the economy or in politics that they feel like is going to affect their business. So instead of, dropping everything that you're doing and going to go chase that new shiny object, I think it's important for chiefs of staff to level with their CEOs or their executives and say, okay, how does this tie into the bigger picture? Does this get us to the next fundraise or the next product launch or whatever it is that we are trying to accomplish? If the answer is no or is unclear, then it's probably safe to say that we can kick that to the side and we don't need to focus on it. However, if it does directly affect where we want to go in the future, then it becomes a conversation about where to prioritize that item.
Hmm. Interesting indeed, Miss Clara. And how do you approach saying no or managing expectation when a founder's ideas are ambitious but unrealistic?
Yeah, I think this is one of the tricky parts of the chief of staff role, but remember why you were hired, right? A chief of staff is hired because a founder or a CEO is looking for that strategic sounding board. You weren't hired just, off the street. You come with a skill set and your opinion should be respected. And so I think that it's important that chiefs of staff learn how to manage upward. They know how to give feedback to their founders in a way that's constructive and productive, and so making sure that you have built up that layer of trust and understanding between your principal and yourself so that you are able to push back when necessary and have, real talk with them when things are getting out of hand, or if there are too many priorities, or, if our eyes are off the ball.
Miss Clara, as a former chief of staff and empowering chief of staff through community, what are your short-term and long-term goals? Miss Clara? I think Miss Clara is just disconnected. So while we're waiting for her, people, please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast. And I think Miss Clara is here already. Sorry for that glitch, people. So my question, Miss Clara, is as a former chief of staff and as a chief of staff through community, empowering them, what are your short-term and long-term goals?
Yeah, short-term goals are to continue to grow our community. We really want to be the space for chiefs of staff to come together, share best practices, learn from each other. Our motto is nobody knows everything, but everyone knows something. And so that is something that we really try to encapsulate is that you might not know everything about being a chief of staff. Most of our members, this is the first time they've ever taken on the role, but between all 450 members, we're going to be able to figure it out together. So I think it's really important to, as our short-term goal, to continue to grow the resources and the community that we offer in our platform. Long term, we want to be the go-to premier resource for all things chief of staff. One thing we really pride ourselves on is that we serve the entire life cycle of being a chief of staff, from finding a role to being successful in the role to figuring out what comes next and even finding your own replacement. So one day I hope to associate Ask a Chief of Staff with anything chief of staff related. If anybody even thinks about hiring a chief of staff or becoming a chief of staff, they know to come to us.
Definitely. And good luck to your goals, Miss Clara, and looking forward for more and more success. And what would be your piece of advice for those people out there want to be, of course, like you?
Yeah, if you are looking to become a chief of staff, I would definitely think about what are the skills and strengths that you bring to the table? What are the executives that you would most like to work for and work with, and go out and chase those people. You know, really find the relationships that you feel like you can build with executives and pitch yourself as a chief of staff. You know, a lot of times these kinds of roles are hidden or, they're not publicly posted. And so it's up to you to try to uncover those opportunities for yourself. So if you find an executive that you enjoy working with, that you feel like you could work really well with, ask them if they're interested in hiring for a chief of staff and see what comes of that conversation.
Yes, and thank you for that advice, Miss Clara. And can you please recommend a book or books that influence your journey?
Yeah, absolutely. So the book that I want to leave everyone with, if you haven't read it already, is called Range by David Epstein. This is a great book for anyone who's ever felt like my career is too wide, I'm too much of a generalist. I've always been told to focus on one thing, but I have a lot of different interests and passions and hobbies. And I think reading this book is really going to help validate a lot of those feelings. And also, it's great for chiefs of staff. Chiefs of staff come from all sorts of different backgrounds and skill sets. There's no one right way to become a chief of staff, but oftentimes it can look like a bit of a windy career path and a windy journey to get to your chief of staff role. So remember that your breadth and the amount and the kind of width of stuff that you do is actually a strength. And this book really helps you rethink this wide skill set and how you are able to utilize that to your advantage.
Thank you for that recommended book, Miss Clara, and I hope our viewers or listeners will read it and for sure they will empower to it. Can you share a success story where you work as a chief of staff transform a company operations?
Yeah, I would say that for our company, when I first joined at that Series A company, we were only 10 people. And we had just raised our Series A not too long before I had started. And one of the things that we really needed to do was hire aggressively. In the time that I was there, which was a little over a year, the company grew from 10 people to 45, and I was responsible for a lot of that hiring, from putting together the job descriptions to doing the first screening calls, figuring out how to move people through the interview process, and really kind of building out that recruiting function from scratch. So, like I mentioned earlier, I come from a recruiting background, and so that definitely helped. But given how early stage the company was, there was also a lot of systems that were not in place yet. So, really learning how to build it from scratch and what's good enough versus what do we need to anticipate for in the future were all really important things for me to keep in mind as I built out that recruiting function.
And Miss Clara, what advice would you give to someone considering a chief of staff role for the first time?
Yeah. Think about who you want to be a chief of staff to. Oftentimes, I argue that when you're a chief of staff, the person you work for is more important than the company you work for. And that's because you will be spending a majority of your time working with that person. Yes, of course, the company should be within your interests, within the kind of bounds of what it is that you want to build your career in. But ultimately, the person that you end up working with is going to be the person that takes up the most of your time. So, if you are considering being a chief of staff, get specific about who you want to be a chief of staff to, where, what kinds of companies, industry sizes, and stage, and that is going to help set you up for success.
Miss Clara, how do you help a founder navigate through decisions like layoff or pivoting the business?
Yeah, those are really difficult things to navigate. At the end of the day, as a chief of staff, you are the strategic right hand. So you are there to help bounce ideas off of, for them to bounce ideas off of you, to help kind of poke holes in things where they might not be seeing or maybe seeing around their blind spots. And then ultimately, as a chief of staff, you're there to help them execute on that vision as well. So even when it's difficult things like a layoff or a pivot, you are there to help think about operationally how to build this through and see it through to its end goal so that your company can continue to move forward and your principal has the things that they need in order to move forward as well.
Miss Clara, before we wrap up our discussion for today, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, people. My other podcast, because my abstract essay is already in fifth season, abstract poetry in second season, and my book 101 review in fifth season too, comedy 101 in second season, and my food 101 in fifth season as well, geography 101 in fourth season, and my baby podcast Law 101 and Mental Health 101, Love Letters in third season, and Movie 101 Review and Music 101 in its fourth season, and Science 101 and Sex 101 in its first season. Please listen to them wherever you listen your podcast. Miss Clara, looking ahead, how do you see the shift of a staff role evolving as the startups and businesses grow?
Yeah, I think the chief of staff role is going to continue to be a power player in any organization. I really believe that every executive could use a chief of staff. And so my hope is to see more chiefs of staff at any one given organization so that executives can continue to free up their time, work in their zone of genius, and accomplish the things that only they can do.
Miss Clara Ma, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and wisdom to the world. So can you please invite our listeners to support your advocacy, your business, or anything that you are doing right now?
Yeah, I would encourage you to all check out our website, askachiefofstaff.com. Anything chief of staff related, we would love to see you there and hope to see you in the next one.
Yes, people, let's support Miss Clara Ma because if you support her, for sure, more and more and more empowering business to come, more and more empowering shift of stuff to come. So, Miss Clara, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Mordicon people, see you soon.